Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start. Everyone can join us as they start to come in. So I'd just like to say good morning to everybody and thank you for joining our virtual recruitment cafe this month. My name is Mary Becker. I'm the program coordinator for research and recruitment at the Center for Clinical and Translational Science, also known as the CCTS. I am here today with Tiffany Bernard, our interim administrative director and associate director of participant recruitment and retention services. Joining us today is our guest speaker, Jennifer Reynolds, Manager of Health Communication, Marketing, and Training at Oak Ridge Associated Universities. Jennifer supports local, state, and federal health agencies, nonprofit organizations, and academic institutions conducting formative research and message testing, strategic communication planning, and developing digital and print communication materials. Some of Jennifer's current projects include providing COVID-19 communication support to CDC's Office of Minority Health and Health Equity, and supporting the Ohio Healing Communities Study. Jennifer has been invited to speak today on part 2 of our previous cafe titled Creative and Copy, and so she will be focusing on the use of plain language and clear communication. The agenda for today will be as follows: a presentation by Jennifer, followed by an open discussion where we welcome questions from everyone. As we go along, if you have something to share or a question you would like to ask Jennifer, we ask that you enter it into the chat box. And at the conclusion of Jennifer's presentation, we will get to as many of those questions as time allows. For those of you that are interested in reviewing Jennifer's presentation following the cafe, or if you know someone that registered and wasn't able to join us live, we will have the slide deck and a recording of this presentation posted on our CCTS website. Because Wednesday, tomorrow, is a holiday for us here, I would ask that you give us several days to get that out there. With that being said, I'm going to turn this over to Jennifer. Jennifer, welcome.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. It's a big honor to be here. I have gotten to meet several folks at the OSU through the Healing Community Study, and it's just a really big privilege for me to come and speak to you about something that I'm really passionate about and that I do a whole lot in my day-to-day job. So let's dive right in. So no introduction needed. My hair is a bit more purple and I think I'm a bit older than in that picture. But I do work for an organization called Oak Ridge Associated Universities. And we primarily are a federal government contractor serving HHS agencies. But occasionally, as with the Healing Study, we get to sometimes do partnerships with nonprofits and university partners. And it's So this morning, I'm going to keep it pretty simple. What is plain language? What are some plain language tips and tricks? I'm going to share some plain language and readability tools with you. And then I'm going to tell you about the No Gobbledygook Awards. Now, special morning prize to any of you who know what the No Gobbledygook Awards are. If you don't, I'm going to keep you in suspense until the end of the presentation when I will reveal what that ridiculous award is. So let's dive in. What is plain language? There are dozens of definitions out there. This one is my favorite. It's from CDC. And it's simply communication your audience understands the first time. And I really like this definition for a few reasons. One, I think it really sets out for us the goal of plain language, and that should be understanding. We don't want the people who are reading our materials to have to work really hard to understand us. And also, I think it lays out for us that plain language is not just about the words that we use. It is a whole set of principles that involve the content, sort of centering our audience as we develop content, the format, and the words we choose, which includes readability. So it's not as simple as one may think. And I think that I have noticed over the years in my practice that plain language is often the biggest challenge for some of our best scientists. And I think the reason why that is that we are so used to in clinical field in particular at being so precise with our language and being so technical that sometimes we feel like we are making an error when we try and make that more understandable for our audience. So why understanding? Why is it important? I love this example. So this is actually from the Office of Disease Prevention at HHS. And they did a series of eye tracking studies. So what eye tracking studies are, they actually bring someone into a simulated lab environment, and they have them read content on a computer screen, and they can actually monitor where their eyes go as they're reading the content. So what they did in this particular series of studies is they gave a health literacy assessment, and then they looked at how various levels of individuals with varying levels of health literacy were reading the content. And they found several interesting things relevant to lower health literacy learners. So they found first that often health literacy, if you have lower health literacy, you're reading more slowly. You're often going back and reading things multiple times to make sure you understand. In some cases, you're actually trying to skip around a page, skip into different paragraphs or places on a page to try and derive meaning when that is difficult for you. And as you can see on this left side, you're just simply working really, really hard to intake the information, as opposed to on the right side, and this is due to a combination of factors, more simple language, more simple layout and format, and potentially more relevant information to the audience, the person is just not working as hard. Their sight lines are following a more logical pattern, left to right, up to down, whereas on this left side, it's just all over the place. They're working really hard. So how can we use plain language? Again, there's dozens of sources out there, dozens of tools, but I've tried to make it really, really simple for us this morning. We want to organize our content and write to serve the audience. We want to write clearly. We want to display that writing in the right way, and we want to do our due diligence in the review process. So let's start with that organizing to serve the audience. I know in your last Recruitment Cafe presentation, the marketing expert talked about audience personas and really designing with your audience in mind. So that same principle should apply to plain language. What does your audience care about? And what is the absolute most information, the absolute pieces of information that are most important for them to know? You want to present only the most necessary information. And I can tell you, this is the one my scientists really struggle with, because we think everything is important, right? It's our life's work. It's our passion. We don't want to give that up. But we do have to remember that our audience is not necessarily as passionate as we are about this topic. We don't want to overwhelm them. We want to make sure that it's digestible and understandable. So try as best we can to only present the most necessary information, put those most important points first, other points in order of importance, and describe what the audience should know or do in a way that makes it easy for them to take action. I so often see this, that people develop a great plain language product, particularly in the area of recruitment, but then they leave out perhaps one of the most important parts is, what do I do? I'm interested, I'm eligible, what do I do? How do I reach you? How do I enroll? How do I take the next step in the process? So, this, folks, is a real recruitment flyer template that I found online. I did not include the URL because we do not want to use this. But this is interesting to me because it's making some assumptions about the audience that may not be correct. So what is this assuming? It's assuming that your audience is motivated to join your study for financial gain, not often the case. And it doesn't provide a lot of key pieces of information that someone might need when they're trying to make a decision about whether or not to pursue participation in a clinical trial, such as what's it about? Am I eligible? And what next steps do I take? So don't do this, folks. I know you wouldn't. Okay. Writing, some tips on how to write clearly and to write plain language. Always use words and numbers your audience knows. This is also commonly said to use common words and phrases. Now, it's important. This is another area where knowing your audience is really important, because sometimes the simplest phrase may in fact not be the most understood by your audience. So I'll give you an example. The phrase, turn in your survey or turn in your sample. To those of us who are, native English speakers, who are, higher health literacy, the phrase turn in a survey makes a lot of sense, right? We've been turning in assignments all throughout our education. But to someone else, that phrase turn in actually takes some different steps in cognition to understand what you mean. So it may be something more simple like submit your survey, submit your sample, may be the better language choice there. Personal pronouns, always try and use you. Positive rather than negative words. So in health communication, we call these gain frames versus loss frames when you're talking about risks and benefits. Obviously, in clinical trials, you do have to describe both, but try and keep a positive spin on this. So it's the difference between telling someone, don't do this, don't do that, and do this, do that. Present tense, active voice, and active verbs are well shown in the literature to be the most easily understood and the most quickly understood. So try and use those wherever possible. Parallel construction, this is one of those terms from way back in the toolbox of English, high school English, that we'll do a quick refresher on. Short sentences and paragraphs wherever possible. Avoid using undefined technical terminology, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Gender-specific terminology, unless obviously that's relevant to your study. Long strings of nouns and shall. I put that in there because you'd be surprised how many times I review things that have shall in place of must. And I think it's because people feel like must is a little bit preachy or, argumentative, and it's really not. It's more clear. So thou shalt not shall, please. Okay, plain language does not mean removing key technical terms, particularly for you all. A lot of what you do is very clinical or medical in nature. So I'm not telling you to not use those, but be sure to define them in clear, understandable ways. And where possible, maybe use analogies, visuals, and examples. Be careful with those analogies. I've seen some cases where the analogy actually can make things more confusing. So that's where it really helps to have a reviewer in your plain language process to sort of check you and make sure that what you think is making something simpler is in fact making it simpler and more easily understood. This here is a list of resources to help support you in using clearer language. So often when I'm writing and I'll be plugging away and I'll think of a complex word and I'll think, what can I say? So these resources are actually essentially like a thesaurus for plain language that help you find simpler words and phrases for some common clinical terms. So my favorite is this one from the United Health Group. It's called the Just Plain Clear Glossary. Super easy to use. Literally, you just type in the term that you want to replace in that search bar, press search, and as you can see, it will pull up a phrase that is a little bit more plain language to replace it. And as you can see, plain language doesn't necessarily mean less words. it simply could mean more words, but simpler and more easily to understand. And this also offers translations in Spanish and Portuguese, which is nice. So numbers. Often our materials need to use numbers. Those can be complicated. So use whole numbers whenever possible. Express risk information and frequencies. So there's been data to support that people understand 1 out of 10 more than, say, 10%. And consider visual presentations of numbers, or if you really need to use numbers at this point in the material. Not going to go through this word for word, but just for your reference, active versus passive voice. Active voice is more easily understood. Now this is that parallel construction, that review. So this is very relevant, particularly when you have a list, a bulleted list, which I think in a lot of your recruitment materials are probably fairly common. You want to make sure that those patterns are similar. It's a bit jarring for a reader to read something such as, to go, going, and playing. So these two examples, we want to find out if you're able to join the study. We will do some screening tests that include answering some questions in a blood draw. Not parallel, we will do and answering. Those are different formats of verbs. So to make that more parallel, we will do some screening tests that include answering some questions and taking some blood. So this is just one of those things you sort of want to tuck back in your mind, and as you're reviewing your materials, make sure that you're using parallel construction. Okay. Display the right way. So I know the previous presenter talked a lot about display, sort of how to make things visually appealing. And that is absolutely necessary, right? We have to get people interested so we even have the opportunity to communicate to them and promote understanding. But once we've sort of lured them in, we also need to make sure that we're displaying things and information in a way that it's easily understood. Headings and text boxes are your friend. Use them liberally and often. Lists and tables are always going to be a good choice when you do have to present a lot of information. You want to chunk it out in ways that are easier to digest very quickly. Margins and white space. I know the struggle when you're trying to fit what you need to in, say, an 8 by 10. Don't cut down on your margins if you can, and make sure that you leave ample white space between your paragraphs. If you don't, it really does impact someone's ability to take in that information very quickly. Consider a question and answer format. And those eye-catching images, as the previous presenter said. So I do want to quickly share an example for you. So I think this is from Florida. So some things that I really like about this. One is it has a headline that grabs the attention of a potential audience member. Is chronic pain impacting your everyday life? We know that chronic pain can be debilitating, and someone with that condition is likely very, drawn to that statement. They're drawn in. The study title, Study for Adults with Chronic Pain. How many of you think that that is the actual study name? Not likely, right? The study name is probably, at least 2 lines at the top of a scientific journal. But they've modified it so that it's really easy to understand in this material, which I think was a good choice. The audience concerns are addressed prominently here in the text box. So the location, where is all of this going to happen? And am I eligible? Right there front and center in sort of a called out way, this really highly relevant information is provided. All of the supporting points are highlighted with subheadings and headings. So, And here's another example for you. Now, this actually isn't a clinical recruitment flyer. This is part of a campaign to increase the number of African Americans that are represented in clinical trials, which is work that we've been doing for a while now with the National Library of Medicine. But I included this just as an example of an absolutely compelling and beautiful image. Now, I know the previous presenter did give you a list of free stock photo sites, and I also really like those sites, but I wanted to provide you this list here as well. In my experience, a lot of those free stock photo sites have really poor selection when it comes to depicting health and depicting providers in particular. So if you are looking for those types of images, definitely check out this list here. These are also free and can be used royalty free, but they may have a little bit more of the types of images that you're interested in for clinical recruitment materials. Okay, review. Often the best reviewer is not the writer, right? So whenever you can, check it over the fence and have someone else on your team review your plain language materials. Correct your spelling, grammar, punctuation, delete those unnecessary words or phrases. If you find that you're a person who does struggle with writing really concisely and identifying the most important pieces of information to include, ask someone else to take that burden for you. Ask them, hey, if you see something that's unnecessary, please mark it and track changes. I'm trying to cut this down. Obviously, make sure your dates and page numbers and all of that is consistent. Look at your visual appeal. Line breaks and page breaks, I see this a good bit as well. Often we will auto split a word, right? So you'll have the two letters and the dash and pull it down. That really can affect readability, particularly for someone who is of lower health literacy. Sort of those line breaks are really hard to comprehend. So make sure that you're not using those whenever possible. And readability. Readability is absolutely something that we need to be cognizant of. So let's talk about readability for a minute. So the data shows that on average, folks read between a 6th and an 8th grade reading level. We know that there are a lot of factors, obviously, that can impact that reading level and bring it down to a lower grade level. And something I talk a lot about when I give her presentations is risk communication. So risk communication is a field of health communication, and this is really its own separate talk. But one of the key principles of risk communication is that under times of great stress, people struggle to understand things, right? It makes sense. I think about COVID and I was, trying to work while also teaching 2nd grade. I can tell you my reading level declined probably 4 grade levels because of my stress level and the fact that I was multitasking. I'm sure many of you can relate. But I also want you to think about your audience and what stressors they may be bringing to their comprehension of your material. So as an example, if your clinical trial may be, trying to reach someone who is newly diagnosed, a new diagnosis can be very stressful, right? So that person may be operating at a lower than normal grade level. And you want to be cognizant of that and really think through making things even more simple than you might otherwise. So here is a list of a few readability tools. I think most of you are familiar with Flesch Kincaid because it is in Microsoft Word. So if you've ever used that, that is what you're using. If you're not familiar with that, I included sort of the definitions for running a readability, scan, if you will, in Microsoft Word. Yes, these other two, Health Literacy Advisor and Style Writer, are There is a fee associated with both of those. So that's just something to be aware of when you're considering them. But yes, readability tools are not perfect, but they can be helpful in at least getting you to get close to where you need to be in these materials, which again, 6 to 8 is sort of the average, but if you can go lower and still convey the information that you want to, that is obviously a great way to go. So here are some other plain language tools for you. So I've included 4, I'm sure there are others. CDC Clear Communication Index and Patient Education Materials Assessment Tool, or the PMAT. These are both scored tools. So with CDC, you will actually have a checklist that you will assign a score. And at the end of that, your score will sort of dictate whether you are where you need to be or where you need to make improvements. And what's interesting about CDC Clear Communication Index is that this is being used by CDC in an interesting way. So not only is it helping to improve their use of plain language, but it's also helping to improve their review process. So in my experience, what had been happening is that someone would develop a material in plain language, and then as it was going through a scientific and technical review, a lot of additional words and information would be added by some of those scientific advisors that would actually make the material more difficult to understand. So now at CDC, when they are going through a review process, they actually include attached to the material the CDC Clear Communication Index score and tool, so that those scientific advisors can also be reminded that plain language is really important, and we want to be very cognizant of that as we are reviewing our materials. The PMAT is an AHRQ tool. So it has I believe it's an agree-disagree scale. There is actually an Excel version of this tool that is an auto score if you're more interested in the automation factors. My favorite on this list is actually the Health Literacy Principles checklist. And the reason it's my favorite is it's just simple. There's no scoring involved. It's simply a list of key pieces of information that you want to keep in mind. So rather than being a burden, this is a great thing to sort of print out and keep on your desk to constantly remember some of these key principles that make your materials more accessible, more approachable, and more easily understood. Okay, the moment, no gobbledygook awards. What on earth are these? So this is actually a real name of awards during the Clinton administration. Al Gore created the No Gobbledygook Awards to award federal government agencies for using plain language. So real thing, go look it up. And here are some examples on plainlanguage.gov that they give you for how the federal government has been instituting plain language. So some before and afters for you from plainlanguage.gov. And I should put a little plug in here. If you are interested in plain language, you would like more training and resources in this topic, plainlanguage.gov is a great resource. I have really tried to be cognizant of, when developing my presentation, to put my sources and links to those sources in the slides so that you can go back and reference those. But that's it. I wanted to keep us nice and short and sweet. So are there any questions or anyone who might want to share sort of their plain language struggles with us this morning?
Jennifer, I'll just add in there, if anybody has any questions, you can either unmute yourself or you can go ahead and put those directly into the chat box and we can read those out for everyone. And while we're waiting for those to come in, there is a question. Is anyone actually required, it's two-parter, is anyone required to actually use plain language, and do they need to implement plain language in order to receive, say, grant funding?
Good question. So I know, no. So I do know that it's CDC, so plain language for the materials that they create. They are required to fill out the CDC the Clear Communication Index, and submit that with their material during the review process. So I know for their internal health communicators, that is a requirement. Now, whether that is a requirement for grants, I do not know. Does anyone else on the call, are you familiar with sort of seeing this requirement, if you will, come up? So someone's typed, I think it depends on the grant. I think you're right.
Jennifer, I have a question. When you were talking about basically, to me, it was like the design, you talked about margins. Is there a recommended margin? Like, is it 1 inch or something that we should follow when creating certain flyers or anything like that?
Yeah, another great question. So no, I don't think that there is a specific margin. Mostly it's don't take away your margins,
Okay.
Which a lot of people will do when they're trying to kind of fill a bunch of text in there. So my recommendation there would be really to fight that urge. You know, if you're really struggling to fit information in there and you're messing with margins and you're moving stuff around, you may want to first think about, is everything here relevant to my audience, not to me as an individual or a scientific writer, but is it relevant to my audience? And, is it, or perhaps instead of an 8x10, you make it, an 11x17, so you can space it out and make it more approachable.
Anyone else have any questions they'd like to enter in the chat box, or that you would just like to speak out? Unmute yourself.
Is playing like I guess it's just kind of discussion type thing. Do you guys find this is a struggle for you when you are working with research teams? Do you find that coming up with a flyer, say, or some other kind of document, and that you get a lot of questions, or maybe you have noticed that when you do make them more simplified, that you perhaps seem to get more interest in your study? Have you guys had any experiences with that? Or anybody wanting to talk today? All right.
All right. I think that was.
Else?
I do not. Jennifer, do you have anything else that you would like to add?
No, if you think about anything in the dead of night, feel free to email me with your questions. I hope that this sort of got you thinking. Mary, to answer your question, I believe the previous presenter talked about it, but Canva is one of my favorite sort of very easy to use graphic design resources. So Adobe offers all sorts of very complicated ones, Photoshop and InDesign and Illustrator. And I'll tell you, those are a struggle to learn. So if you're not doing this frequently, I think Canva is really a great bet. Adobe Spark is also a decent one. Yeah.
Yeah, we recommend Canva to a lot of people to use. We find it's really easy, and I think the templates and things kind of take kind of the guesswork out of the design. So it's helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And the struggle, I'll tell you, social media, if you're using social media for recruitment, you have to be even more, more precise and even
Yes,
shorter with your language, which I'm sure y'all have talked about in the past.
yes.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your knowledge regarding the use of language and clear communication. Just to let everyone know, in case you do have this question and missed it at the beginning, we will be sending out a feedback survey in the next several days regarding this presentation. So if you also have a topic that you would like to see us discuss at a future cafe, please let us know in the bottom of the survey. I believe that we can also include the link to this recording today on the survey as well. It will also include the slide deck. So feel free to share that with anyone. And I think we're going to give you back a little bit of your day. And again, I see some comments here. People have found this super helpful, Jennifer. So thank you so much for presenting. Everyone out there, stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Take care.
Of course. Have a good one, everyone.